The Knights of the Cross by Henryk Sienkiewicz. If you like this kind of content, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Chapter 29. The foresters, under the direction of the head huntsman, placed the hunters in a long row at the edge of the forest, in such a way that, being hidden themselves, they faced the glade. Nets were fastened along two sides of the glade, and behind these were the men whose duty it was to turn the beasts toward the hunters, or to kill them with spears if they became entangled in the nets. Many of the Kerpi were sent to drive every living thing from the depths of the forest into the glade. Behind the hunters there was another net stretched. If an animal passed the row of hunters, he would be entangled in it and easily killed. The prince was standing in the middle in a small ravine, which extended through the entire width of the glade. The head huntsman, Mrokota of Mokarzew, had chosen that position for the prince because he knew that the largest beasts would pass through this ravine. The prince had a crossbow, and leaning on a tree beside him was a heavy spear. A little behind him stood two gigantic defenders, with axes on their shoulders, and holding crossbows ready to be handed to the prince. The princess and Girandouna did not dismount, because the prince would not allow them to do so on account of the peril from urus and bisons. It was easier to escape the fury of these fierce beasts on horseback than on foot. Delorcha, although invited by the prince to take a position at his right hand, asked permission to remain with the ladies for their defense. Zbyszko drove his spear into the snow, put his crossbow on his back, and stood by Danusia's horse, whispering to her and sometimes kissing her. He became quiet only when Mrokota of Mokarzew, who in the forest scolded even the prince himself, ordered him to be silent. In the meanwhile, far in the depths of the wilderness, the horns of the Kerpi were heard, and the noisy sound of a Krzyżacy answered from the glade. Then perfect silence followed. From time to time the chatter of the squirrels was heard in the tops of the pines. The hunters looked at the snow-covered glade, where only the wind moved the bushes, and asked themselves what kind of animals would first appear. They expected abundant game, because the wilderness was swarming with urus, bisons, and boars. The Kerpi had smoked out a few bears, which were wandering in the thickets, angry, hungry, and watchful. But the hunters were obliged to wait a long time, because the men who were driving the animals toward the glade had taken a very large space of the forest, and therefore they were so far away that the hunters did not even hear the baying of the dogs, that had been freed from the leashes immediately after the horns resounded. After a while, some wolves appeared on the edge of the forest, but having noticed the people, they again plunged into the forest, evidently searching for another pass. Then some boars, having emerged from the wilderness, began to run in a long black line through the snowy space, looking from afar like domestic swine. They stopped and listened, turned and listened again, turned toward the nets, but having smelt the men, went in the direction of the hunters, snorting and approaching more and more carefully. Finally there resounded the clatter of the iron cranks of the crossbows, the snarl of the bolts, and then the first blood spotted the white snow. Then a dreadful squealing resounded, and the whole pack dispersed as if struck by a thunderbolt. Some of them rushed blindly straight ahead, others ran toward the nets, while still others ran among the other animals, with which the glade was soon covered. The sounds of the horns were heard distinctly, mingled with the howling of the dogs and the bustle of the people coming from the depths of the forest. The wild beasts of the forest, driven by the huntsmen, soon filled the glade. It was impossible to see anything like it in foreign countries, or even in the other Polish provinces. Nowhere else was there such a wilderness as there was in Mazowsza. The Knights of the Cross, although they had visited Lithuania, where bisons attacked and brought confusion to the army, were very much astonished at the great number of beasts, and Sir Delorch was more astonished than they. He beheld in front of him herds of yellow deer and elks with heavy antlers, mingled together and running on the glade, blinded by fear and searching in vain for a safe passage. The princess, in whom Kęstuć's blood began to play, seeing this, shot arrow after arrow, shouting with joy when a deer or an elk which was struck reared and then fell heavily, plowing the snow with his feet. Some of the ladies in waiting were also shooting, because all were filled with enthusiasm for the sport. Zbyszko alone did not think about hunting, but having leaned his elbows on Danusia's knees and his head on the palms of his hands, he looked into her eyes, and she, smiling and blushing, tried to close his eyelids with her fingers, as if she could not stand such looks. Sir Delorch's attention was attracted by an enormous bear, gray on the back and shoulders, which jumped out unexpectedly from the thicket near the huntsman. The prince shot at it with his crossbow, and then rushed forward with his boar spear. When the animal, roaring frightfully, reared, he pierced it with his spear, in the presence of the whole court, so deftly and so quickly that neither of the defenders needed to use his axe. The young Lothaриnger doubted that few of the other lords, at whose courts he had visited during his travels, would dare to amuse themselves in such a way, and believed that the order would have hard work to conquer such princes and such people. Later on, he saw the other hunters pierce in the same way, many boars much larger and fiercer than any that could be found in the forest of Lower Lotharingen or in the German wilderness. Such expert hunters and those so sure of their strength, Sir Delorch had never before seen. He concluded, being a man of some experience, that these people living in the boundless forests had been accustomed from childhood to use the crossbow and the spear. Consequently, they were very dexterous in using them. The glade of the wood was finally covered with the dead bodies of many different kinds of animals, but the hunt was not finished. In fact, the most interesting and also the most perilous moment was coming, because the huntsman had met a herd of urus and bisons. The bearded bulls, marching in advance of the herd, holding their heads near the ground, often stopped as if calculating where to attack. From their enormous lungs came a muffled bellowing, similar to the rolling of thunder, and perspiration steamed from their nostrils. While pawing the snow with their forefeet, they seemed to watch the enemy with their bloody eyes hidden beneath their manes. Then the huntsmen shouted, and their cries were followed by similar shoutings from all sides. The horns and fifes resounded. The wilderness reverberated from its remotest parts. Meantime, the dogs of the Kerpie rushed to the glade with tremendous noise. The appearance of the dogs enraged the females of the herd, who were accompanied by their young. The herd, which had been walking up to this moment, now scattered in a mad rush all over the glade. One of the bisons, an enormous old yellow bull, rushed toward the huntsman standing at one side, then seeing horses in the bushes, stopped and bellowing, began to plow the earth with his horns, as if inciting himself to fight. Seeing this, the men began to shout still more, but among the hunters there were heard frightened voices exclaiming, "The princess! The princess! Save the princess!" Zbyszko seized his spear, which had been driven into the ground behind him, and rushed to the edge of the forest. He was followed by a few Litwins who were ready to die in defense of Kiestut's daughter. But all at once the crossbow creaked in the hands of the lady. The bolt whistled, and, having passed over the animal's head, struck him in his neck. "He is hit!" exclaimed the princess. "He will not escape." But suddenly, with such a dreadful bellowing that the frightened horses reared, the bison rushed directly toward the lady. At the same moment, with no less impetus, Sir Delorch rushed from beneath the trees, and leaning on his horse, with his spear extended as in a knightly tournament, attacked the animal. Those nearby perceived during one moment the spear plunged into the animal's neck, immediately bend like a bow and break into small pieces. Then the enormous horned head disappeared entirely under the belly of Sir Delorch's horse, and the charger and his rider were tossed into the air. From the forest the huntsmen rushed to help the foreign knight. Zbyszko, who cared most about the princess and Danusia's safety, arrived first and drove his spear under the bison's shoulder blade. He gave the blow with such force that the spear, by a sudden turn of the bison, broke in his hands, and he himself fell with his face on the ground. "He is dead! He is dead!" cried the Mazars, who were rushing to help him. The bull's head covered Zbyszko and pressed him to the ground. The two powerful defenders of the prince arrived, but they were too late. Fortunately, the Czech hlava, given to Zbyszko by Jagiełło, outstripped them, and having seized his broad axe with both hands, he cut the bison's bent neck near the horns. The blow was so powerful that the animal fell, as though struck by a thunderbolt, with his head almost severed from his neck. This enormous body fell on top of Zbyszko. Both defenders pulled it away quickly. The princess and Danusia, having dismounted, arrived at the side of the wounded youth. Zbyszko, pale and covered with his own and the animal's blood, tried to rise, but he staggered, fell on his knees, and leaning on his hands, could only pronounce one word: Danuska. Then the blood gushed from his mouth. Danusia grasped him by his shoulders, but being unable to hold him, began to cry for help. The huntsman rubbed him with snow and poured wine in his mouth. Finally, the head huntsman, Rokodov Mokarzev, ordered them to put him on a mantle and to stop the blood with soft spunk from the trees. "He will live if his ribs and his backbone are not broken," said he, turning toward the princess. In the meanwhile, some ladies of the court, with the help of other huntsmen, were attending to Sir Delorch. They turned him over, searching in his armor for holes or dents made by the horns of the bull. But besides traces of the snow which had entered between the joints of the iron plates, they could find nothing. The Urus had avenged himself especially on the horse, which was lying dead beside the knight. As for Sir Delorch, he was not seriously injured. He had fainted, and his right hand was sprained. When they took off his helmet and poured some wine in his mouth, he opened his eyes, and seeing the sorrowful faces of two pretty young ladies bent over him, said in German, "I am sure I am in paradise already, and the angels are over me." The ladies did not understand what he said, but being glad to see him open his eyes and speak, they smiled, and with the huntsman's help raised him from the ground. Feeling the pain in his right hand, he moaned and leaned with the left on the shoulder of one of the angels. For a while he stood motionless, fearing to make a step because he felt weak. Then he glanced around and perceived the yellow body of the Urus. He also saw Danusia wringing her hands and Zbyszko lying on a mantle. "Is that the knight who rushed to help me?" he asked. "Is he alive?" "He is very severely injured," answered a courtier who could speak German. "From this time I am going to fight not with him, but for him," said the Lothaриnger. At this time the prince, who was near Zbyszko, approached Sir Delorch and began to praise him because he had defended the princess and the other ladies, and perhaps saved their lives by his bold deed, for which, besides the knightly reward, he would be renowned not only then but in all future generations. "In these effeminate times," said he, "there are few true knights traveling through the world. Therefore, pray be my guest as long as possible, or if you can, remain forever in Mazowsha, where you have already won my favor, and by honest deeds will easily win the love of the people." Sir Delorch's heart was filled with joy when he heard the prince's words, and realized that he had accomplished such a famous knightly deed, and deserved such praise in these remote Polish lands, about which so many strange things were told in the East. He knew that a knight who could tell at the Burgundian court or at the court of Brabant that when on a hunting party he had saved the life of the Mazowietka princess would be forever famous. Zbyszko became conscious and smiled at Danusia. Then he fainted again. The huntsmen, seeing how his hands closed and his mouth remained open, said to one another that he would not live. But the more experienced Kirpi, among whom many an one had on him the traces of a bear's paws, a boar's tusks, or an urus horns, affirmed that the urus's horn had slipped between the knight's ribs, that perhaps one or two of his ribs were broken, but that the backbone was not, because if it were, he could not rise. They pointed out also that Zbyszko had fallen in a snowdrift, and that had saved him, because on account of the softness the animal, when pressing him with his horns, could not entirely crush his chest, nor his backbone. Unfortunately, the prince's physician, the Ksiądz Wyszoniak of Giovanna, was not with the hunting party, being busy in the chateau making wafers. The Czech rushed to bring him immediately, and meanwhile the Kirpi carried Zbyszko to the prince's mansion. The Knight of the Cross, Hugo von Danveld, helped Danusia mount her horse, and then, riding beside her and closely following the men who were carrying Zbyszko, said in Polish in a muffled voice, so that she alone could hear him, "In Szczytno I have a marvelous balm, which I received from a hermit living in the Hercyński forest. I can bring it for you in 3 days." "God will reward you," answered Danusia. "God records every charitable deed, but will you reward me also?" "What reward can I give you?" The Krzyżak approached and evidently wished to say something else, but hesitated. After a while he said, "In the order, besides the brothers, there are also sisters. One of them will bring the healing balm, and then I will speak about the reward."
Remember to subscribe.